Hey everyone, Matt Baird here, host of the ATA podcast. Welcome to episode 18, which coincidentally is our first of 2018. Each month on the podcast, we bring you news and insights from the American Translators Association. Today's episode is all about how ATA works. Now, if you're new to ATA, or the podcast for that matter, then you've hit the jackpot today. Why? Because this month's episode is designed for you. But even if you're a longtime member and haven't really found the time to really get to know the association, today's show is for you too. So whether you're thinking about joining or about to celebrate 2 decades of membership, you're going to learn something new in today's podcast. ATA is a big place. If you come on in and start exploring, you'll find a wealth of resources and opportunities for professional development, networking, marketing, and more. It can be overwhelming at first, a complex maze of committees, divisions, and chapters. Today we're going to give you a bit of a blueprint to help you understand the structure. That way you'll be better equipped to navigate the maze and get the most out of your membership. So don't touch that dial. Whoa, I think I just dated myself. Joining me today is Corinne McKay. Corinne is currently serving as ATA president. She is an ATA certified French to English translator and author of several books for freelance translators. Corinne has been a frequent guest on the podcast, most recently in episode 17 last month, in which she gave us a recap of the association's accomplishments in 2017 and took a brief look ahead at the goals for her presidency. Corinne, welcome back to the podcast.
Oh, thanks, Matt. Thanks so much for having me and for all of the incredible work that you put into the podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, you're back here again, and I know you thought you were off the hook for a while after last month. But here we are. Did you at least get some R&R over the holidays?
Yeah, I did. So, here in Colorado, we try to pay attention to our work-life balance. So I did some mountain biking in New Mexico with my family and then some skiing in Colorado now that it's finally snowing. So it was good.
Nice. I'm jealous. When I was there, the snow wasn't so great the last time I was there.
Right.
But yes,
it's improved. Yeah,
if there's something Coloradans know how to do, I think it's work-life balance.
Yes.
Let's get right into the program today. We're talking about how ATA works. And to say that ATA is a large organization is a bit of an understatement. Over 10,000 members, 13 volunteer board members, you are one of them, 18 committees, an estimated 500 plus volunteers, and that's all supported by a staff of 11 management professionals. We're going to take a tour through the entire structure today to give our listeners an idea of how the association works. But why don't you start us off by giving us a quick overview? How does this huge association work?
Yeah, so I think the 3 things I would say are organization, structure, and lots of volunteers. That's the short answer. So our staff members are certainly at the helm, but we depend on our awesome volunteers, like yourself for that matter, to drive our efforts on the ground. So something like this, a staff member doesn't host the podcast. It's something that needs to be member to member. So you do that. And the board provides kind of strategy and big picture guidance. And as you commented, we finished 2017 with a bit over 10,500 members. So thanks to every one of you for being a part of ATA.
That's great. It's great to hear. Now, the association is governed by its bylaws. Tell us, why does ATA need bylaws in the first place? And can those bylaws be changed? Do they change over time?
They sure do. So, corporations of all types have bylaws that specify their key governance procedures. So, even though ATA is a nonprofit, we still need bylaws. So, in the ATA bylaws, you'll find critical things like how the board is composed and how it operates, how our elections work, who can vote in elections, what types of membership categories we have, how chapters and divisions work, and all kinds of things like that. So I guess depending on your level of passion for association governance, the bylaws could either be really fascinating or the kind of thing you read when you have, severe insomnia, depending on your preference, how you look at it. Some people really like to geek out on association governance, and some people think like, oh my gosh, this is so dense. How does anyone make sense of it? But to your second point, the bylaws can be changed and certainly have changed quite a bit over time. And how to change the bylaws is covered in Article 15, Amendment of Bylaws. So basically, the board can propose a change or members can propose them using a petition process. And then our voting members get to vote on the change, and they require a 2/3 vote to pass. So 2/3 of the people have to vote for it in order for it to pass. So as an example, if you were at the most recent conference, or if you voted in the most recent election in our Washington, D.C. conference, we had a proposed bylaws amendment at the most recent conference, and it failed. So that's an example of how the voting membership gets to have a significant role in how the association works.
Okay. Moving on, ATA has an elected board of 9 directors and 4 officers. You, of course, are one of the officers as president. And as I mentioned, has a staff of 11 at its headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia. What are the board's responsibilities, and what does the staff do?
That's an important distinction. So, in a nutshell, the board is responsible for strategy and the staff are responsible for operations. So, for example, when we revamped the ATA Chronicle, the board recommended strategic changes such as decreasing the number of issues, making the articles more relevant to our members' day-to-day work, and creating a more robust online version of the magazine. And the staff then brought those recommendations to life. So they solicited proposals from media companies, for example, that provide many of those services. But for example, the board doesn't fight about what font the Chronicle is going to get printed in or what picture is going to go on the cover. I mean, unless we have a specific suggestion, which we could always give if we wanted to. So in terms of something like the conference, I think what the staff do versus volunteers is really apparent because, for example, the president-elect and conference organizer, which is the role that I filled for the past 2 years and has now been very capably taken over by Ted Wozniak, the conference organizer provides big picture guidance. So, for example, maybe I would come up with the idea that we should have a job fair, or that we should revamp the pre-conference day into what is now our AST seminar day. But the staff decide how that happens. So it's a huge difference if you come from a background where you volunteered for a local association where volunteers do everything. So before I was on the ATA board, I was the president of Colorado Translators Association, and we had, like most chapters, we had no paid staff at all. So I did things like print the conference name badges at midnight the night before the conference. I actually think back in the day, I think I paid my daughter to do it when my daughter was like 8. But the point being, every little detail, including things like printing the badges, can the venue do, gluten-free vegan meals? Our secretary just had a baby. Do they have a nursing room at the place where we're having this professional development seminar? Being on the ATA board is really, really, really different from that because you are a lot less involved in the details of operations and a lot more involved in strategy.
But you are, as a board member, elected by the members.
Yes.
And bylaw amendments, which we just talked about, are voted on. You mentioned they require a 2/3 vote
Mm-hmm.
of those who vote. So tell us a little bit about the election process and the voting process within ATA.
Mm-hmm. So it's a good time of year to talk about that because we're just starting the next election cycle of the people who will run for director positions at our 2018 conference in New Orleans. So we have two processes or two potential paths to running for a position. Typically, the Nominating and Leadership Development Committee, which was chaired for several years by past President Dorothée Rousset. Thank you so much, Dorothée. She has now stepped down, and it is now chaired by David Rumsey, our immediate past president. So the chair of the Nominating and Leadership Development Committee would contact board members and key volunteers to form a lengthy list of potential candidates for board and officer positions, depending on what's going to be open that year. They then narrow those down to people who are both qualified and interested. And each year we have at least 3 director positions open because the 9 director slots are on a rotating cycle of 3-year terms. So 3 people's terms expire every year. But this year we're actually going to have 4 terms expiring because you might remember, if you were at the last election, Tony Guerra was appointed to fill a 1-year vacancy that was created when Karen Kachik, who was a sitting board member at the time, was elected to secretary. So typically we run 6 candidates for the 3 director slots. But since we try to have a bit of a firewall between the nominating committee and the board, I actually don't know what they're planning on doing this year, which is, I think, a good thing that the nominating committee operates independently so that there is not any perception that the board gets to sort of handpick who runs the next time. That is certainly not true. Like, I give my input just like everybody else does. But as an example, when Ted Wozniak was nominated for president-elect, I found that out at the same time you did, which I think is a good thing. So the officer positions are 2-year terms, and all of the officers turn over at the same time. So the current slate of officers, which is myself, Ted Wozniak, president-elect, Treasurer John Milan, and Secretary Karen Kachik, we will all serve together until the 2019 conference, at which time Ted automatically becomes president. I rotate off the board, and John and Karen can run again or not, because you can run for 2 terms for those positions. So also we have a petition option. If you look at Article 7, Section 2, Item D3 in the bylaws, you can run for a board or officer position by petition. So first you have to meet the requirements for that position, and then you have to get 60 voting members of ATA to sign your petition, and you can run even if you weren't nominated by the nominating committee. And I think it's worth noting that we have had petitioned candidates run even for officer positions and win. So that's not just a theoretical option. I think, for transparency purposes, it's important to say that the slate is not limited only to the people the nominating committee nominates, that as long as you meet the requirements for the position and you get 60 signatures, you can run by petition. In terms of elections, you have to be a voting member of ATA to vote. And right now, that means that either you have to be ATA certified or you have to meet the criteria to be an active or corresponding member. And corresponding member can be sort of a confusing term, but it basically just means an active member who is not a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident. And right now, the 2 ways to become an active member is to be ATA certified or go through active member review. And if you really want to geek out on that, that's Article 3, Section 2A of the bylaws. And you can apply for active member status online. It's fast and free, and then you can vote and make your voice heard.
Let me follow up on that last point, active member status and the whole process of applying for that. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I still think there's a little bit of confusion out there as to how that works.
Yeah, sure. I think you're right about that because in the past, I mean, even when I first became an ATA member, that if you wanted to do active member review, you had to actually get reference letters from clients and mail them to ATA headquarters. But I think now there's confusion about how easy the process actually is. So you could do this in the time it takes to answer me this, for me to answer this question. You could become a voting member if you meet the requirements. So here's what you do. Go to the ATA website, put active member review in the search box, and you'll get the webpage for it. And it's completely on the honor system and free. So once you pick the option that qualifies you to be a voting member, such as you've worked as a translator interpreter for 3 years, you have a degree or certificate in translation and interpreting or other things, it's literally less than 5 minutes and maybe even less than 1 minute. You just check the box saying that the qualification you picked is correct, and then you are done. And I'm sure it took me longer to answer that question than it would take you to fill out the form once you find it on the website.
Okay.
Really.
All right. So no more excuses to everyone who's out there listening who's not yet a voting member. It takes just a couple of minutes. But don't do it right now. No, don't go and do it right now. Wait till the end of this podcast, and then click over to atanet.org.
Yes.
Right. Moving on, let's talk about some of the policies ATA has. ATA has, for example, a code of ethics and professional practice, and other policies and procedures. There's an antitrust compliance policy. Tell us a little bit about those policies and why they are in place and what's the benefit for members.
Sure. So part of our role as a professional association is to maintain the highest standards in the professions we represent and to say, here are the standards that our members must agree to abide by in order to remain members of ATA. So as you mentioned, we have a code of ethics and professional practice, and our members agree to abide by that. And if they don't, if you feel that an ATA member has violated that code, you can file a complaint with our ethics committee, and they will determine if that member did in fact violate the code of ethics and professional practice. And if so, there may be a sanction against that member, which could run from sort of a private reprimand up to having their membership permanently revoked. And again, that's not a theoretical example. That has happened. So I feel like this is a service not only to our members, but to the general public, because you don't have to be a member to file an ethics complaint about a member. The person you're complaining against has to be a member, but you don't have to be. And with that, I wanted to give a big shout out to our incredibly hardworking volunteers on the ethics committee who review all of the complaints. And it is a huge and obviously very sensitive job to be on the ethics committee. So thank you so much to the people who do that.
Okay, now speaking of committees, let's talk about them. Many of ATA's activities and programs are overseen and administered by a number of committees, and there's 18 of them to be exact, if my counting was correct. Mm-hmm. Why does ATA have committees, and let's talk about how they work.
Mm-hmm. So in an association the size of ATA, we obviously need subgroups to get things done, because if you just, threw 10,500 people at every issue, I don't think that would work so great. So our bylaws specify what are called the standing committees, which are the committees that we're required to have unless we pass a bylaws amendment to get rid of them. So those are the executive committee, which is just a fancy name for the officers, the finance and audit committee, ethics, membership, and nominating and leadership development. So those are the ones that the bylaws says that we have to have. But these days we have many others, such as education and pedagogy, interpretation policy advisory, business practices education, our all-important certification committee, and many more. These committees are key because they do specialized work that requires people who are interested and knowledgeable in a certain topic to work on. So as I said, you really don't want, 10,500 people crowdsourcing how to run the certification program. So you need a committee to really dive into that task. And of course, members can give input, but you need a core committee of people who actually do the work of it. And if you're interested in getting involved with an ATA committee, you can talk to the chair of that committee and see if they have stuff that needs to be done and if you could be plugged in there. And they are all listed under the governance tab of the ATA website.
We also are going to be putting up some links on the show notes to today's podcast. So if you happen to be on that page, you'll find links to the committees and the divisions and the bylaws and some of the other things we're talking about, including a link to how you can become a voting member. Now, Corinne, you are chair of the Government Relations Committee, so I'd like to take this opportunity to briefly talk about what that committee does.
Sure. So the Government Relations Committee is a relative newcomer on the scene compared to, say, the Certification Committee, for example. But it was created in response to an increased need for ATA to do advocacy work concerning mostly the federal government. Sometimes it's state and local government, but mostly the federal government's treatment of translators and interpreters. So if any of you participated in the Advocacy Day at the DC conference, and I know you did, Matt,
yes.
The position papers that you passed out there are a reflection of the type of work that the Government Relations Committee would do. The Government Relations Committee didn't write those. JNCL, the lobbying organization we belong to, wrote them. But that's an example of the type of thing that government relations does. So it's definitely policy wonky, but it's really, really, really important. For example, so that on the General Services Administration schedule, translators and interpreters are classified as professional or specialized workers rather than technicians or clerical workers. Or, for example, so that we can work to try to change things like the government using lowest price technically acceptable bidding when they award language services contracts versus best value bidding. So those are kind of dense, but I do feel like, one function of the fact that we are 10,000 people versus just me as an individual translator or interpreter is that we have a much bigger voice to go to the U.S. government and say, as the largest professional organization representing language professionals, here's our view on how translators should be classified. Here's our view when the government has to award a contract for court interpreting services, how they should go through that selection process.
All right. Thank you. Now, ATA is also divided into a number of divisions, 20 in fact.
Yep.
What is the purpose of having divisions?
Yeah, so I like to think of the divisions as our members' sort of landing pads within ATA. So in an association of 10,500 people, you really need a smaller group of like-minded people where you can make connections, and the divisions do that. So when you join a division, you can connect via email. Lots of the divisions now have Facebook groups or in person. with people who work in the same language or specialization, because we have both language and specialization related divisions. So you could join, let's say, the German language division, the Korean language division, or the science and technology division, for example. And the divisions propose speakers for the conference, they organize social events at the conference, and they give members a place to connect with other people who do similar work. And maybe you can say, Matt, since you're a very active member of the German language division, some of our divisions, if you're listening to this and you live outside the US, even have in-person events in other countries. Like I know the GLD does that.
Yeah, that's right. We have a group, members in Europe, that has been getting together now 7 years. And in fact, in early February, we are meeting in Berlin for our 5th annual one-day workshop, complete with social events. And we have over 30 people coming. And it's a great way. I would encourage any division members out there living
Yeah.
outside the country to find and locate other division members in your area. It's a great way to get together. As we realized several years back that we only saw each other at the annual conference in the US, even though we all live over here in the old country. And
Right.
it's been an absolute great way to do some additional networking and getting together with colleagues.
Yeah. And I think, when you become a member of a division, you see that lots of the divisions have really interesting things of their own going on. So I'm a member, obviously, of the French language division. We have a podcast. We have our own podcast that is, topics specifically of interest to French translators. And, the medical division has a ton of resources for medical translators and interpreters on their website. So I think, when you think of the power of the divisions, here's a statistic that always blows me away. To our knowledge, if the interpreters division were its own association, it would be the largest interpreters association in the world. It's
Wow.
over 4,000. It's over 4,000 members.
Wow, that's big.
So, right. So that tells you, the divisions are pretty powerful. They really are, I think, as, with the size of ATA, they really are like an association within an association. So if you are not a member of a division for the kind of work you do for your language or specialization, get on that. It's included in your membership, so there's no reason not to do it.
Totally agree. Now, when you just thought this big ship of ATA couldn't get any more complex, there are also a number of ATA chapters. So how do chapters fit into all this?
Yeah, so chapters are generally state or regional groups that are associated with ATA either as full-fledged chapters or as affiliated groups. So a chapter could be, for example, I'm a member of the Colorado Translators Association, but we even have chapters that are, or groups that are just for one city, like the New York Circle of Translators, or there's Houston Interpreters and Translators Association. So some of them are for small areas too. And chapters provide a way for people in the same geographic area to get together and have professional development events, social events, or even mid-year conferences. Like here in Colorado, we have a conference every year in April or May. And I just think that chapters are a great entry point. So I started out in Colorado Translators Association about 16 years ago, and that was my first connection to the translation profession. And I know you are a longtime member as well, Matt, of CTA. So it's a great way to plug in to what's going on in your local area. And I just think as freelancers, one thing that all of us need more of is face-to-face contact with people. And chapters are a great way to do that because, it's a big commitment to go to the ATA conference, especially if you are just starting out. But certainly your chapter is going to have events that you can attend and meet other translators in person. And at least here in Colorado, we try to have a mix of informal stuff, like we have a coffee and a happy hour every month. And then we have a large holiday party. We have a 2-day conference. If anyone wants to make a trip to Colorado to attend that, um, Look, just to put in a little plug for that, if you've been dying to come to Boulder, Colorado, we have a 2-day conference that is already scheduled for this year. So take a look at that.
Right on. That's great advice, Corinne, and I couldn't agree with you more. And that's a perfect way to come full circle in this podcast. We started at the top, so to speak, with the board and bylaws, and we've wrapped things up here with the periphery, so to speak, the divisions and the chapters. And I can only emphasize what Corinne just said. Listeners, if you want to get involved and learn more about ATA from the ground up, then get involved in your local chapter or your division.
Yeah, definitely.
So Corinne, with that, thank you so much again for joining me today and for your time. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you too. It's always a pleasure.
Let me add a little footnote here. CTA was also one of the first places I encountered other translators, and the German language division was where I first landed, as Corinne said, and started volunteering for ATA. That's it for our show today. Previous episodes of the ATA podcast can be found on ATA's website, atanet.org, under Resources. You can subscribe to us on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, Stitcher, and other podcasting apps. And if you have a moment, please leave a review or spread the word on social. Speaking of social media, like I say at the end of every podcast, ATA has a Facebook, and yes, we're on Twitter and LinkedIn. So if you haven't already, be sure to connect with us on your favorite channel. And please, don't hesitate to send me your comments and suggestions anytime. Just write me an email. The address is podcast@atanet.org. Who knows? Your suggestion just might be the next ATA podcast. Episode 18 was produced by myself with support from Corinne and ATA Assistant Executive Director for Membership and Communication, Mary David, as well as ATA Assistant Executive Director for IT and Operations, Rashawn Paccarel. The music you heard today was from bensound.com. Tune in next month when we take a look back at ATA's first ever Advocacy Day in Washington, D.C. Learn how ATA members became language lobbyists on Capitol Hill for a day, urging Congress to improve working conditions for the language industry, especially when it comes to how the federal government works with the industry. Thanks again for tuning in, everyone. Talk to you again next month.